Okay, so our study this morning begins in Exodus chapter 12, and we'll be talking about beginning of months for the people of Israel, and of course the preparation for being safe from the last plague that God will bring upon the Egyptians, and how He provided for the safety of the Israelites in connection with that. Earlier this morning, Billy and I were talking about the plagues and how we would determine the time period that elapsed between the plagues, or the time period surrounding all of the plagues. And we really just don't have any information about that, of how long that happened. The only reference of time that we have in connection with this whole period is 430 years. So we find that God said that His people would go down to another land that they didn't own. They would live there for a period of time. They would be in slavery there, and then they would come back. Let's turn over to Genesis chapter 15 for just a minute and take a look at that passage. And this will help us to understand God's promise throughout this period of time. And this is including the promise that God made to Abram about a son. And so in verse 6, it says that then he believed in the Lord, and He reckoned it to him as righteousness. And that's a passage that we often look at in connection with Abraham's faith. And in verse 7, he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldees to give you this land to possess it. And he said, O Lord God, how may I know that I shall possess it? He said to him, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, and a 3-year-old female goat, and a 3-year-old ram, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. Then he brought all these to him, and he cut them in two, and laid each half opposite the other, but he did not cut the birds. And so you remember when we studied this, this was a sealing of the covenant, the sacrifice that Abraham made. They laid the animals out, and the Lord walked between them to signify that. And in verse 13 it says, and God said to Abram, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. But I will also judge the nation whom they will serve, and afterward they will come out with many possessions. And as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace, you shall be buried at a good old age. Then in the 4th generation they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. So the Amorite lived in the land of Canaan, and God said the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet full. So when they came back into the land of Canaan, they would drive out the Amorite and many others, unfortunately not completely ridding the land of those people, but nonetheless that was what they were to do. So the Lord here refers to a general period of time of 400 years. Later on we'll look at Galatians chapter 3 here in just a little bit, when we talk more about this, and I don't want to get too deeply into it before we get to that point, but we'll see the period of the Apostle Paul mentioning there 430 years, and we'll discuss that a little bit further. I also might refer you to the appendix in the back of our book. You might read that sometime. On page 250 specifically, he talks about 430 years and how there's a possibility that they could be split up into two 215-year sections, and how that might relate. So that'd be something that if you haven't already done so, you might want to read that a little bit later on. But as we come to this period of time where we've been talking about these plagues up until now, how many plagues has God brought on the Egyptians thus far? I'm sorry? 9. That's right. Well, let's see if we can name those 9. First of all, it had to do with the Nile River, didn't it? And that was what?
Water turning to blood.
Water turning to blood. And then up out of the Nile River came frogs. That's right. And after the frogs, there were the flying insects or the lice. And then following that, there were the flies. And then upon the cattle he brought the murrain of cattle, or the death of the cattle. That's right. And then following that, there were the bulls. Okay. And then the hail. And then locusts. That's right. And then after the locust, he brought forth darkness. Okay, so that gets us 9. Is that right? I think that's all 9. Okay, so today we'll talk about that huge plague. Not that the others were not, cataclysmic in the lives of the Egyptians. Some of them more so, some of them less so. But specifically, we get to the death of the firstborn, then we talk about something that really affects every household in Egypt, as we will see. But as we start our lesson this morning, we talk about the beginning of months. The first month of this new year. And it's interesting how we're in a new year, and we're in the first month of our new year. But this is really a line of demarcation, if you will, for the Israelites. Their whole calendar, if you will, if they even had a calendar, starts afresh right here. And so he tells them that this will be the first month of the year for them. And I've got March/April there. That the first month of the year in the Jewish calendar began in our month, or our months of March and April, kind of split those. And so he gives them 10 days before he tells them what to do. He's preparing them for this feast that they're going to have in this first month of this new year. And he says, on the 10th day of the month, you are to get either a lamb or a kid of the goats of the first year, so a yearling. And it is to be a male. And what else about it?
Be spotless.
Spotless, that's right.
Free of defect.
And so this lamb or this kid of the goats was to be supplied, or I should say put up, if you will, stalled, as we often say, on the 10th day of the month. So you're to get this lamb based on the eating of your family. This is going to be for a meal. So he describes all of that for them. He says, now, if this lamb is too much, if your family is small and this lamb is too much for you to consume in one sitting, one meal, then you're to share that with another family. And if your family is large and you have, I'm assuming from what is said, it's not specifically stated, but I'm assuming from what it said, if they had a very large family, then they would have more than one lamb that they would need to prepare and consume. And so he specifies that this was based on how much they would consume or eat. And so they were to take the spotless yearling male lamb, a sheep or goat, kept until the 14th day of the month. And so, why not 7? Why not 21? Why? We don't know. God specified the 14th. And so that's when they were to partake of that lamb. And he says, now this was interesting to me. I'd really not thought about this to this extent, but he said, when you do this, then the whole congregation is to kill this at evening. Now, I'm not suggesting that that Moses is telling us through inspiration that they were to have a great assembly and then kill the lamb and then they would depart to their houses. I don't think that is the case, but I think what he's trying to tell us is that this was all to be done at evening, and so evening would have been for the Israelites what time of day?
I think after 6 o'clock.
6 o'clock, yeah, 6 o'clock or a little bit after. So we look at that evening that way today too. So while the new day for the Israelites started at 6 p.m., ours generally, we think of that as starting at midnight, our new day. But whatever the case, don't let me confuse you about that. The congregation would kill that animal at that evening. They would take the blood and put it on the doorpost and the lintel of the residence. So let's go back. So this gentleman here has some hyssop in his hand, and he's got his son holding and maybe even his firstborn, I don't know, holding this container of blood, and he's putting the blood on the lintel. That's the casing that goes across the top of the door. And then the doorpost you see on each side of the door, he would put that on that. And so that was the instruction that they were given. And so they were to do that prior to consuming the meal. They'd take that blood and put it on the lintel and the doorpost, and then they would prepare that lamb or that kid of the goats. And how was it to be prepared? Roasted, that's right. It wasn't boiled. It wasn't cooked in any other way. It was roasted. They didn't deep fry it or anything of that nature. It was just roasted. And so they had bitter herbs with that, and also unleavened bread. Now, we'll talk about the unleavened bread, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, here in just a few moments, but recognize that the Passover was that meal that began and included the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Okay, the Feast of Unleavened Bread lasted for 7 days. And so that meal was to be prepared and eaten. As I mentioned earlier, it wasn't to be raw, it wasn't to be boiled with water, but roasted with its head, its legs, and innards, or inwards. Sounds a little odd for me to say inwards, but that's what the Bible says, and that's the proper way to say that. So it was to be eaten and not left till morning if possible. So it was to be completely consumed, right? If any was left, they were to burn the remainder with fire. And so that was to be completely consumed on that day. So as they were preparing that, they would, put the blood on the lintel and the doorpost, and they would go in, they would roast the lamb, and instead of cleaving it apart, it was to be roasted whole. And so that was important instruction that the Lord gave to the children of Israel, that it was to be whole and not chopped up and cut apart until it was ready to be consumed. And there was a special way that they were to partake of this meal. You remember that? It was eaten with them fully clothed, their loins girded, and you remember the common dress of the Israelites would have been a long garment, outer garment, and they would have a girdle or belt around their waist. And so in order to move swiftly or work or whatever they had to do, they would pull that up off the ground so that their feet could move as they needed to, and they would gird that garment up with that belt. And so he says, have your loins girded, have your shoes on, have your staff in your hand, and eat it in haste, ready to leave. I'm not an Israelite or a Jew, but it seems like I always eat in haste, whether I'm ready to leave or not. That's what they were to do. It was an urgent matter. God said they were to prepare this, partake of it urgently, being ready to go out. And we see how a little bit later how this turned out to be the case. God was preparing them for getting out of Egypt in the Exodus. So Jehovah tells Moses and Aaron, he says, on the night of the 14th of that first month, I'm going to go throughout Egypt, and I'm going to smite all the firstborn, both man and beast. Jehovah would execute judgments upon all of the gods of Egypt. Now, recognize he has already put the judgment against the Nile and turning the water to blood. He has, and George mentioned, I think it was Wednesday evening, talked about that God that had the frog with it on as the head. The frogs he had controlled, and lice and flies and cattle and the people and all these with the bulls and all these other things. And now he's going to execute judgment on the firstborn of the Egyptians. Now, Alice asked me a question the other night as we were leaving when we were talking about the firstborn. Would that include the firstborn of the women or the girls? And at the time I said, well, the Bible tells us firstborn, so I'm assuming so. But I went back and I wasn't really happy with that answer that I gave you. And so I went back and I looked at that. The word man from Hebrew is Adam. Adam means man. I think we talked a little bit about that in our study of Genesis. This is the masculine or male noun for mankind. So if you look up mankind, and mankind would generally have two parts, right? Male and female. Not generally, but does. Two parts, male and female. Then this word, Adam, is the male counterpart for mankind. So it seems from this rendering of the term man that God slew the male firstborn of the Egyptians rather than male and female firstborn. Now, I wasn't there, I don't know, but the Bible doesn't tell us any differently. The Hebrew language itself points to the male, and so I think we have to make that conclusion. And as I thought about, prior teaching, and not that I had done, but others had done, I think that's what's suggested here. Whether that's the case or not, really, is not the point. But I think that is what occurred on this occasion. So I just want to bring that up for our discussion and understanding there. And so God is preparing Moses and Aaron and the people, and Moses and Aaron are going to go in and talk to Pharaoh about this. They're going to go in and tell him what's going to happen. And once again, the Lord said Pharaoh's heart will be hardened. And there's a point that's made about that over at the end of this lesson. I think it would be good for us to talk about now. At the bottom of page 30. Bottom of page 30, he says, we need to point out one more time, however, that it was not God's fault that that Pharaoh was so stubborn. God knew what kind of man Pharaoh was, and God allowed him to come to the throne at this particular moment so that the Egyptians could be punished for the way they had treated the Israelites. God hardened Pharaoh's heart by putting demands before him that Pharaoh was too stubborn to obey. He did not take a good man and make him evil. Rather, he allowed an evil man to come to the throne so that he could show his power over the strongest nation in existence at that time. God did not take away Pharaoh's ability to choose right or wrong. So here, in connection with this, we've been talking about this all along, and And John's brought up a point or two about Pharaoh. We need to understand here that Pharaoh had a hard heart. God used him for his purposes, just like he used other kings and other nations for his purpose, and even still does today, I'm convinced. But here Pharaoh was such a man that was so stubborn. He wanted to hold on to what he thought was his, and that included the Israelite slaves. And so he then became stubborn and hard-hearted and would not yield. Any comments or questions about that? Murphy?
You know, this is the exact opposite of Calvinism that says we're created equal.
Yes.
Exact opposite. The Calvinists, I guess, would say, well, Pharaoh was born that way.
Yeah,
Their
that's
doctrine
right.
would force them to do that.
Yeah. Good point. Okay. Any comments or questions about the firstborn of man? Anything? Yes, Ken.
You were saying that the firstborn was a female, she would die, but with the secondborn male or whatever, I mean, would there be one in every household that would die? I mean, that's the question.
That's what the Bible says, that there was one in every household.
So that would be the secondborn,
So-
the male.
Yeah, the male could have been born after a female, but he would still have been a firstborn male.
Verse 29 explained that.
Why don't you read it for us, John?
And it came to pass at midnight that the Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on the throne, to the firstborn of the captive, who was in the dungeon, and all of the firstborn of the livestock.
Okay, go ahead and read verse 30 as well.
And so Pharaoh rose in the night, he and his servants, and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt. For there was not a house where there was not one was dead.
Okay. All right, so the death in every house in the Egyptians. Of the Egyptians. And so that tells us the story about that. And so God's way of protecting his people from being taken, the firstborn of the Israelites being taken, was that when I see the blood on the lintel and the doorposts, then this will be a token that there are Israelites that live there, and the destroyer will pass over them and do no harm. A memorial and a feast for the Israelites permanently or forever. The Passover meal and the 7 days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So he begins to then talk about the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. And so again, as I said earlier, the scriptures state that there was to be no leaven in the house. No leaven in the house from the 14th day through the 21st day of that first month. And so that whole period of time, including the Passover meal, which occurred on the evening of the 14th, they would partake of unleavened bread. And so essentially the Passover started the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. Two separate things so far as their meaning and the way the Jews understood that, or the Israelites understood that, and the way they were to be observed, except that the unleavened bread was part of the Passover meal. The Passover meal itself was in signification and memorial of God or the destroyer passing over the Israelites. Yes, Murphy?
And you know, you go back to verse 8, and they shall eat the flesh in that night, roast with fire and unleavened bread. And I found an internet, bitter herbs they shall eat. I wonder, did the bitter herbs have any kind of special significance? Were you able to find anything?
Not that I know of, other than the fact that that was an addition to the meal, just part of the meal, and I don't know if that signified, the time of slavery that they spent and the rigor that they had to work under, or what that was. But that was just part of that meal, and it would have been something that would have stood out as not a common practice among the Israelites, I imagine, in their meal.
Right.
I don't imagine they would have commonly eaten those types of things, with the exception of the lamb, but they would not generally, if you are a husbandman or a herdsman, generally you take the weaker of the flock. You know, if you want something for your meal or for your household, you'll take the weaker of the flock and let the stronger continue to reproduce, and the unspotted continue to reproduce. But in this case, you take the best for the Passover meal. Scott?
You think that possibly all these very specific instructions are a form of a faith test?
I think that's so. I think that when because the Bible is pretty clear, even in this passage, that the Israelites did exactly what God asked them. And so they are coming along now and recognizing, after all of these plagues have come upon the Egyptians and they've not suffered, that God is indeed taking care of them. And so that builds faith in them, excuse me, in the preparation for this, in such that it's special, is a test of faith.
We also see in the future, when the laws come about, that it's always the best. And that makes a person come to their own conscience, and they look at their herd, and they want to say, "God, I don't want. That's my best. That's my best sheep." But God wants you to depend on Him and trust in Him also.
Right.
By giving your best, you're trusting in the Lord at the same time. You're saying it don't matter. If you're saying to yourself, "It's not mine anyway. God bless me with it." So if you follow the thinking through and involve your heart, it's really just a molding. It's a molding of our character, isn't it? It's bringing about. You either depend and trust in me, or you don't, and your actions will show. Your works, I'm afraid to say, show me your faith in your works.
Right. Yeah, that's right. And he's specific about what would happen to them if they, had leaven in the house. We'll talk about that in just
That speaks to fairness, really. It's like, if you can't afford that, get a pigeon.
Right.
All these, he provides for the reasonable, fair, if you will. I don't know what to use that word. But
Yeah. Right. Equity, I guess,
yeah,
maybe.
just the justice of God.
Right.
Absolutely.
So, in regard to the Feast of Unleavened Bread, then, the Lord tells them this feast, which begins on the evening of the 14th, included the Passover meal, lasted for 7 days through the 21st. No leaven in your houses. Any guilty of eating leaven would be cut off from among the people. That's pretty severe punishment, isn't it?
Yes.
God's going to be honored. He's going to be glorified. And it may be in our disobedience and our death, spiritually, or it will be in our obedience and our faith. So we see that all throughout. And God is going to lay some things on the Israelites, but He's going to bless them so that they can meet those requirements. And in connection with them living in Egypt, they had the best portion of the land for their cattle. The Pharaoh that knew Joseph recognized that. We don't know at this point in time what their herds are like, if they're able to keep their herds up and still, live in slavery or not. But He has in some way provided for them to each have, no matter their status, whether slave or taskmaster or whatever they were, not taskmaster, but overseer, they still had access to a lamb or a kid of the goats of the first year. So God provided for them in that connection. And this is one of those meals that they didn't have an opportunity to provide a substitute. This was one of those feasts that they couldn't use a pigeon. So they followed after His commandment, and each did as Jehovah had said. The 14th and the 21st of the month were also to be a holy assembly, or some of your translations may refer to this as a convocation to Jehovah. So they would have a great period of worship that day. There would be no work on these days. And the only work that was to be done in the observation of these feasts was preparing the food to be eaten. The sacrifice made of the lamb or the kid of the goats, the preparation of the bitter herbs, the kneading of the unleavened bread and the baking of that. That's the only work they were to do that whole day. And so the rest of that portion, excuse me, the rest of that portion of that day would be used in worship to God. Observe this observation of this feast is observed as the day in which Jehovah brought them out of Egypt. Of course, that specifically had to do with the Passover, but it also had to do with the Feast of Unleavened Bread, in that he commanded that to be what they ate in the Passover feast and the days following. So it was all centered around this time when the Egyptians asked the Israelites to leave and go, and God provided that for them. It was to be observed throughout generations as a permanent ordinance. There are Jews today, people who claim to be descendants of the first Israelites, who claim to follow after Christ, that still observe these sacrifices and these types of things. Probably not to the extent that they did then. But, and I'm not, saying that they're Christians, or I think they call themselves evangelical Jews or something of that nature. But they still observe these, and they at the same time recognize Jesus as being the Son of God and being the Passover lamb, if you will, for sin. And so, if we had someone that was a Jew who decided they wanted to be a Christian, they recognized the New Testament as the covenant of God, faith in Christ and obedience to Him, and in regard to the New Testament was what was to be done. If they so chose to partake of this Passover feast, to me, that would not be something that would keep them from being faithful to God as far as the New Testament is concerned. Now, if they did say, well, this is required in order to be a Christian, or this is required,
Right.
then that would be a different thing.
Yes.
So that would kind of fall in the realm, and I'm not trying to muddy waters here, but that would kind of fall in the realm of Romans chapter 14, I think.
Yes.
In that connection, it would be something that conscientiously they would like to do, because it had to do with their people back in this time. But as far as the permanent ordinance is concerned, obviously that was taken away with the rest of the law. And we will see that as we continue to study and understand more about the old law and how that for our day and time is no longer in effect. Point to be made about unleavened bread itself. Jehovah was very specific about them having no leaven in their houses and to eat only unleavened bread. He said the offenders, whether they were aliens, meaning whether they were non-Jews, or whether they were native people, would be cut off from among the Israelites. Now, there's a couple of things that we notice here. First of all, God is serious about what He says when He talks about how they will partake, prepare, and consume this particular meal and what this feast had to do with. It was about unleavened bread, not leavened. And this harkens back to where we talk about them leaving out of Egypt, with the dough still in their kneading bowls and strapped to their backs, rolled up in their coats and that kind of thing. They went out speedily in a hurry. That's the reason for this feast in the future. Second thing we notice is that there were aliens among the Israelites. In other words, they were non-native Jews, as we would call them today, or non-native Israelites. They were not related to Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, and all of those others. Egypt was a very large country. Egypt was a very powerful country. The Israelites were not their only slaves. And obviously there would have been peoples that would have attached themselves to the Israelites, knowing that if they went with them, they could go out of that nation and not be, taken back. They probably had seen the power of God in all of these miraculous signs as well. May have even suffered as a result of some of them. But they were with the company of the Jews as they exited Egypt. And the scripture talks about that not only in this chapter, but in the next chapter as well, and others, when it talks about those that live among you that are not of the children of Israel. And so they were to, if they were going to be part of this company, then they were going to have to obey the rules that God had laid down in connection with this feast. And so in all of their houses, they were to eat unleavened bread. Specific things, a few more specific things that were to be done. Moses called the elders to him and explained what was to be done. God said, you go tell the elders that this needs to be ready. You need to be ready for this. And he's telling them 10 days in advance to take that lamb, put it up until the 14th day, and then this all is going to happen on the 14th day. I want you to be ready. And so he said, go and take for yourselves lambs according to your families or according to your eating, and slay the Passover lamb. Dip hyssop in the blood and apply it to the lintel and the doorposts. Do not go outside until morning. Why would they not go outside? Bill?
The angel came, he would kill them.
Okay. They would not be under protection of that house. In that house where you find the blood on the lintel and the doorpost, there was safety, there was protection. And there's a point that can be made there about the church. There is protection found among brethren.
That's right.
In the church. I'm not talking about this building, this physical building. I'm talking about the church, those of us that gather here and worship. And that's the same way it is throughout. And it's not just our congregation. Church universal really is the idea there.
Yes.
And so, as Billy said, that destroyer would come, the angel of death, as some translations refer to, would come, and all those not under the protection of that blood would be killed. Yes, Scott.
It makes me visualize being covered by the blood.
Yes.
When you leave that doorpost, you no longer covered, that your whole structure is almost literally covered by the blood.
Right.
We are covered in a sense today, washed.
Yes. Yes, that's right.
Again, an early lesson of sin and blood and death. God requires shedding
Right.
blood.
Right, and we're just learning this along, but really he instituted that back there with Cain and Abel.
Mm-hmm.
We told them what to provide for a sacrifice. And so they would have known more so than us, but as we see that, we begin to understand what the importance and significance of blood is.
Yes.
All right, so Jehovah will pass over. Upon smiting the firstborn of the Egyptians, when Jehovah sees the blood and the door on the lintel and doorpost, he will pass over the door and not allow the destroyer to come in. Now you see how I've got that word destroyer highlighted. Does King James Version use destroyer there?
It does.
Okay. I was thinking that I looked through all of the most common translations, and I say all of them, the King James, the New King James, American Standard Translation, the New American Standard, I think all of those use the word destroyer. If I'm not right about that, please correct me. And so the idea then is that the destroyer was most likely an angel whom Jehovah tasked with killing the Egyptian firstborn. And so the question may come, let's turn over to 2 Samuel 24 while I'm mentioning this. The question may come, why did the Lord not go and do that himself? Well, I think that is a good question. It's a common question that we might, ask in connection with this. My idea about this is that God could not be involved with these uncircumcised, unclean people. And then the other thing may be that he just had the angel to do it. I don't know. None of that really matters. My opinion, whatever. None of it really matters. The fact remains that that's how he did that. In 2 Samuel 24 and verse 16, the passage states, and this is a pestilence upon Israel here that is spoken of. Verse 15, so the Lord sent a pestilence upon Israel from the morning until the appointed time, and 70,000 men of the people from Dan to Beersheba died. When the angel stretched out his hand toward Jerusalem to destroy it, the Lord relented from the calamity and said to the angel who destroyed the people, it is enough. Now relax your hand. And the angel of the Lord was by the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. And David spoke to the Lord when he saw the angel who was striking down the people and said, behold, it is I who have sinned, and it is I who have done wrong. But these sheep, what have they done? Please let thy hand be against me and against my father's house. So, on that occasion, when God sent this pestilence against the people, David pled the case of the people, and he stopped there at the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite and did not destroy Jerusalem. But he destroyed 70,000 people from Dan to Beersheba, and he did that by the hand of the destroyer or the angel. Sometimes we refer to him as the angel of death. I don't know if it's just one specific angel or if it's just, different angels that the Lord happened to use, but that's what the scriptures tell us about that. So that's really the only thing that we have of a detailed nature that we can apply to what occurred to the Egyptians on that occasion, but we do know that it was termed the destroyer. All right, as we get back to this observance of the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, God says, this is an ordinance to thee and to thy sons. And specifically, he's referring to the firstborn, but generally, he's talking about teaching your sons about this and why this occurred. And so I think this is even further illustration to the point I was making earlier about the firstborn males being the ones that were killed. He says, keep this service in the land you come to. What land is that? Canaan. Yeah. When your children ask about the Passover, tell them, it is the sacrifice of Jehovah's Passover when he destroyed the Egyptians' firstborn. And so this is the information, the direction Moses is giving to the elders of the people. He's giving them instruction about when to take the lamb, when to put it up, when to kill it, how to prepare it, when to eat it, how to eat it, how to teach about it, everything that they needed to know. And so, upon hearing this word, they bowed and worshiped. When Moses explained to the elders what was to be done, all of the people bowed their heads and worshiped Jehovah. And so evidently this was an occasion where Moses was speaking to the elders of the people, and then in turn they would tell the people what was going on, because at the conclusion of all of it, the people were the ones that bowed down and worshiped. And then the very important thing that's mentioned here, the people did just as Jehovah had said. Faithful people are always referred to in that way. When Noah built the ark, how did he prepare the ark? Just like the pattern that God gave him. When Abraham took Isaac up on that mountain to slay him, he did that just as the Lord had commanded. And so, when Joseph went down into Egypt, he followed God's will. He was faithful to him, just as Jehovah had commanded. And so it was here with Moses and the people. And so it's such a beautiful thing to see that, and that point being made, that they did just as he said. Now later on that's not necessarily the case, but in this case it was. So at midnight Jehovah went throughout Egypt, and the destroyer killed the firstborn of Pharaoh and all others. What was God's promise about that? About who would be killed? You remember what he said? Even from Pharaoh's son, even to the damsel or the maiden that is grinding at the mill, the firstborn will be killed. There was not a house of the Egyptians, according to verse 30, as John read a moment ago, that did not have a death. All of the firstborn of the cattle died as well, just as Moses had said, just as God had told him to say. And so Pharaoh and all of the Egyptians rose up in the night, realizing that their firstborns were dead. And Pharaoh, in the middle of the night, calls Moses and Aaron. Do you see now why God said, eat this meal with your loins girded, your shoes on, your staff in the hand, and ready to go? Because Pharaoh drove them out in the middle of the night.
Yes.
So Pharaoh told Moses to go and worship Joseph, just as he had said. In verse 32, he says, be gone and bless me also. I don't know exactly what that indicates, except for the fact that Pharaoh is saying, if you'll be gone, just please make this stop. Or if you'll be gone, I'll receive a blessing because you're not here to vex me any longer, or what exactly that means. But that's what Pharaoh had to say. The people of the land urged the Israelites to go. So they made preparation to depart. The Israelites bound up their kneading troughs, their unleavened dough upon their backs, and prepared to leave. And there's a point that the Waldrons make here in this material, is that you'll see Bedouins traveling today much like that. They'll have, their kitchen hardware on their back, bound up. Be riding the camels or walking beside them, leading the camels or whatever. The Egyptians were spoiled of jewels, of silver, gold, and clothing, and whatever else the Israelites asked. So they took their families, their flocks, their herds, their cattle, all of these jewels and raiment. And it seems from later on as we get out in the wilderness and they start building the tabernacle, it seems that they received a great amount of cloth and other things like that they were able to build the tabernacle with. So all of those coverings would have taken a great amount of fabric. So it's very interesting what they were able to plunder from the Egyptians as they left. And so at the end of Exodus 12, we learn that they started out in Ramses, which was in the land of Goshen, and they traveled to Succoth, and Succoth is just one of those places that just means booths. It was probably a temporary settling place for, they traveled that far during that one day or night and day, and then they stayed there that night in a place that they called Succoth. And they stayed in tents. One other thing I was going to mention when we were talking about the blood on the lintel and the doorpost. When the Israelites come to Egypt, it seems like that they had benefited greatly from being there during the time of Joseph and just immediately after, before that other Pharaoh came to power. They were able to have permanent dwellings. They lived in houses. They didn't live in tents anymore. Abraham would have been amazed to see that, because he lived in tents sojourning through the land wherever he went. Isaac would have been amazed to see that. And so now Jacob, in his later years, as he comes into the land of Egypt and is able to see his children and his grandchildren, and maybe even his great-grandchildren, was able to live in one of those houses. And how that must have been a blessing for him in his later days. So I thought that was very interesting. In this passage, we find that a mixed multitude goes out with the Israelites. Again, the mixed multitude has to do with other people that left Egypt with the Israelites that were not Israelites, because one, they saw the chance for freedom. They could blend in with the crowd, so to speak, and get out of there. Secondly, some of them were indeed interested in following Jehovah because they had seen his power work. And others probably just, maybe they wanted to go with the Israelites because they saw how blessed they were. A number of reasons there, but that brought together a mixed multitude of people. Their flocks and their herds and much cattle. They ate unleavened bread because of the haste in which they left Egypt. That first feast of unleavened bread was essentially partaken of on the run. They didn't stay there for 7 days after the death of the firstborn. They were driven out immediately. And so for those first 7 days, they had nothing but unleavened bread. So that's another interesting point to be made in connection with that. All right, 430 years. Here we get down to close to the end of chapter 12, as I was mentioning earlier. Let's see. Looking for the verse. 40. Okay. Now the time that the sons of Israel lived in Egypt were 430 years, and it came about at the end of 430 years to the very day that all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. So, Billy and I were talking about this earlier this morning too. I think when God addresses Abraham, he says, at the end of the 4th generation, then you will come out of Egypt. He was talking to Abraham about his 4th generation, so that would have been Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and Joseph's sons. So we don't know if Joseph's sons were still alive during this period of time or not. There's no special mention of them that I can think of. We may learn that a little bit later. So that's what he was talking about, the 4 generations. And that's why he generally refers to that as 400 years. Here Moses speaks specifically about the 430 years. In Galatians chapter 3, 16 through 18, let's look at that passage. Galatians 3, 16 through 18. Ms. Janice, when you get there, would you read that, please? Galatians 3, 16 through 18.
Now to Abraham and his seed were the promise made, he said not, and to seeds of many, but as of one, and to the seeds which is Christ. And with 16 through,
18.
okay. And this I say, that the covenant that was confirmed before of God in Christ, the law which was 450 years after, cannot disannul, but it should make the promise of none effect. For if the inheritance be of the law, it is no more a promise, but God gave it to Abraham by promise.
Okay. So there, the Apostle Paul refers to that as a period of 430 years that they would dwell in Egypt. And so he says this is a night to be much observed. Now let me just explain that first sentence there on the chart. The time from the promise to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12 to the day of Passover was 430 years. Now that's my view of that. That may not be exactly right. Some people believe, and may very well be correct, that they spent 430 years in Egypt. If that was the case, I think we'd be talking about more than 4 generations from Abraham. But again, that's just an opinion. Whatever the case may be, and the difficulty, we were talking about that, the difficulty of dating this. We know that the Exodus occurred about 1450 BC. And so that would mean that they would have been in captivity started captivity about 1880 BC, which I believe predates Joseph. And so, but you could study that for yourself, do a little research, and see what you come up with. All right, let's move along. Commands about the Passover. All the congregation of Israel was to partake of it, no foreigner to eat of it, no uncircumcised male to eat of it. One law for native born and sojourners, all were to be circumcised, and the lamb was not to be taken out of the house. I think I want to wait till Wednesday night to begin talking about this. I've got just a couple of slides about Jesus being our Passover. But let's wait till Wednesday night to talk about that because we're really out of time. Any comments or questions or anything that you'd like to mention?
So we're on page 31.
We'll start with Exodus chapter 13.
Yes. And just one more thing. The blood belonged to God at the very beginning. They were not to eat that. They were to spill that on the ground and not eat that. It was God. And blood is life.
Yes,
That's right.
that's right. That's what protected them from the destruction.